Whether on the field, on the court, or on the balance beam, there's more to winning than the final score. Hi, I'm Patrick Manning of Black Desert Resort. We recognize the effort it takes to succeed. That's why we are proud to partner with Utah Checkdown, the podcast that tells you the story before the game, then gives you a recap of what happened when it's all over, the grit, the glory, and the disappointments. Join us for stories of Utah's finest athletes and coaches. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong, and I'm happy to be back. Got a little Christmas break, I guess we could call it. There really is no break in sports. It's always going on, but got a chance to kind of do less. We'll say that. So it was nice. This will be the last podcast of this year, so kind of seeing out on the 2024 year, and then we'll continue this through 2025. Don't worry. But we'll get one more before the 2024 year concludes. So before we jump into it, let me tell you about our partners, Black Desert Resort. Black Desert Resort isn't just your home, it's an endless retreat where life is played your way, from intimate studios to spacious 4-bedroom suites. The raw beauty of southern Utah is in your new backyard. Discover its championship golf course, exquisite dining, and world-class outdoor adventures, all yours to conquer. This is luxury your way. Learn more about owning a luxury residence at blackdesertresort.com. Come play, come stay. All right, so it's been about 2 weeks. I think it's actually been 2 weeks exactly since I last chatted with you on this podcast. And a lot has happened, right? It was December 16th that we last talked, and obviously the transfer portal had been open for, what is that now, 7 days or so. So it had been a week. It was wild, right? The transfer portal was a wild season, we'll call it. It is a season because it is a lot. But that window is now officially closed. So on Saturday at 11:59 p.m. local time, so wherever you're at, the transfer portal closed at 11:59. So any player on a team can no longer put their name into the transfer portal after that time. So after Saturday, you weren't able to put your name in the transfer portal anymore. So anybody that hasn't announced yet from Utah, they're seemingly locked into the transfer portal until the April window. It's a 10-day period in April, but that's after spring. Most aren't going into that transfer portal period just simply because it's harder to kind of get into a system and be a starter on a new team if you're not in the portal by the time of last Saturday. So now there's some nuances here. The transfer portal, it does close officially on Saturday. But the thing there is teams have a 48-hour grace period to essentially get those names in. So what has to happen is a player has to declare his intent to be in the transfer portal, let the school know officially in whatever capacity it may be before 11:59 p.m. on Saturday, and then the schools have 48 hours to get those in. This doesn't happen that often. It does happen, but most people that have wanted to go into the portal are doing it now. There's generally not an 11th hour, 12th hour type situation. However, it does happen. By all accounts, I haven't heard any of that happening with Utah. We're still in that 48-hour grace period because it would be tonight at 11:59, where essentially that 48-hour period is there. But for the most part, these schools are pretty quick at getting players into the portal. If you were in the portal, you probably hear about it by now. That's not to say something couldn't pop off and something change, but knock on wood, I guess. I don't need to have any more of that. The second I publish this podcast, suddenly somebody enters the portal. But so there is that. It's not fully clear yet until that time is done, but you're pretty much set on that roster that Utah has, and we'll kind of go into some of this and kind of what's there and available and all that stuff. But that's kind of where it is. Now, there is a 5-day period after that's still available for teams that are currently in a bowl game. So, for example, any of the teams that are in the playoffs, or there's a handful of other teams that are in a bowl game, there's a 5-day period after that where they are able to essentially enter the portal. So you're going to potentially see guys going into the portal after this. Don't be confused by that. It's essentially just a situation where teams have an opportunity to continue to play through their season and then just declare there. Now, obviously, that timeline shrinks because anybody that wants to go into the portal and get there for spring season, kind of acclimate with their new team, generally has to do it in the first few weeks of school. So, for example, at Utah, you have to be enrolled at Utah by January 10th. Now, there's some wiggle room there. There's, the last ad drop day for colleges is January 17th, but there takes a little bit more nuance that goes into that. Obviously, if Utah wants a player there, the university generally is going to work with them. Excuse me. But the situation there is you want to be in there for spring. So any of these teams that are currently in the playoff and they want to be able to go into the portal, they either have to decide this weekend or this week, I should say, because you have the games on the tomorrow and on Wednesday. Any teams that lose, you'll probably see a 5-day transfer portal thing sitting there. But then there's other teams that can, but you're running up to those deadlines for various schools. Now, other schools have different deadlines. Some work on different semesters or trimesters or whatever it may be. So you still may see some teams. But for Utah, that's the main point of this. It's for Utah, they don't have another period. This is it. Anybody that hasn't already gotten into the transfer portal has no chance until April. So there's that. One more scenario there is any of these coaches out there, if they leave or are fired from their school, players have a 30-day window to be able to transfer and go into the portal. So barring Utah firing Kyle Whittingham, which would be pretty wild, but there's nothing there. So just kind of some updates on the transfer portal and how it works. Now, with that said, there is some confusion where some people think that because the portal closed that you can no longer pick up players. That's not the truth. You just have to get into the portal, and now schools have a chance to be able to pick you up, and they can be picked up from now until essentially the season begins. But like I said, if you want to get in for spring, you need to be able to do that in the next 10 days or so to be able to be eligible for enrolling in school and all of the academic requirements that are required for the NCAA football, which is funny that academics are still part of this, but that's not a discussion for today. So but you'll see that. You're going to still see Utah hosting visitors. They're still going to be looking for people in the transfer portal, and we'll go over some of these position groups and some of that stuff. But for the most part, any player leaving Utah has already done so. So, you're set there. Now, before we get into all of the players that have left and kind of the conversations about that, an interesting thing came up today with UConn head coach Jim Mora. He tweeted about this, talking about the transfer portal, and I'm just going to read what he tweeted. It says, "A simple note to the schools and coaches that have blatantly broken NCAA football rules by tampering with our players in the last 24 hours. We do know who you are. We will pursue all avenues to hold you accountable. We are excited that we've built a program where coaches have to cheat to beat us, and we will protect that program. Think hard before you tamper with us." And then he had a hashtag just getting started. Now, this is nuanced, right? Because there's, tampering in college football. I understand fans get really frustrated with this, and Utah fans especially have a real reason to be able to complain about tampering because it happened to them, especially with a few key players. And so this rule, or not rule, this thing that Mora spoke out about absolutely applies to Utah. It doesn't happen to every single school, but for the most part, a lot of schools are tampering, right? A lot of P4 teams are tampering with lower division schools, just trying to get them to come up. You have other P4 schools, tampering with others. It's across the board. So this isn't just one school. This isn't, this is all across college football. The problem there is there's no real rule against it. I mean, there is, you're not supposed to be tampering. You're not supposed to be having these conversations. But the reality is the NCAA is having a hard time even enforcing any of its rules related to NIL or eligibility or anything like that. Recently, Diego Pavia, the Vanderbilt quarterback, he just won a lawsuit that allowed him to be able to gain his JUCO years back so that he's able to play one more season. That had now opened up an opportunity for all JUCO players to play at least one more season in this next year based on a temporary restraining order. Not restraining. I don't know. I can't remember the legal term. It's not coming to me right now. Essentially, there's a stay, right? So, nobody, the NCAA is not going to be able to enforce that because the courts have ruled that now the eligibility requirements are kind of being held under question. So we've had a lot of court debates over eligibility recently. This is the latest one. It's not going to be done. But you're getting players that are able to stay a little bit longer, and you're also having a hard time getting players to, stay committed to a team because there is tampering. And so for the NCAA to try to enforce that, there's not really much that they can do. And a lot of these coaches, quite honestly, are going to be insulated with this because either there's boosters or collectives that are being the ones that are tampering. And so you've got a lot of this that's a problem. Now, that's not to say that these coaches or these, administrative staffs or anything aren't clean. That they're not, right? Like, the real reality is these conversations are being had. There's just a way to insulate that so that it doesn't fall back to the head guy or one of the coaches or different things that way. This is happening everywhere. That's the nature of college football. You're trying to find out players that can come to your program and can, work out. Some of these players come into the transfer portal with a do not contact tag. That generally means that you already have a destination in mind. Where else is that destination coming in mind unless they've tampered and had a conversation with somebody else? See, you kind of get that. So, it will take people like a Jim Mora and other coaches or athletic directors or conference commissioners actually doing something to kind of air the dirty laundry to make it happen. The problem is nobody really wants to do that. Jim Mora can go out there and say these things on Twitter, but the reality is, unless there's some sort of legal ramifications, and there might be, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know fully what this is. Maybe you can sue the school, or maybe there's different things that you can do that way. Outside of that actually happening, there's nothing that's really going to take place, right? If Utah wanted to tamper with a school, unless there's specific evidence, and even if there is evidence, that other school has to be able to come forward and, make a claim. And make a claim in probably a legal setting. And if they make a claim in a legal setting, they better make sure that they're clean themselves, because you better believe that that's going to be found in discovery. And so this becomes a tricky thing. Years ago when the whole Adidas thing blew up in college basketball, basketball had been, funded, AAU and all this other stuff had been funded for years by shoe companies and other things. All of this was happening under the table. Everybody knew it was happening, and everybody wanted to call everybody out on it. But the problem is everybody was doing it outside of a few. And so who was going to actually put their neck out there and actually do it? And so this is the challenge, the same thing in college football or in any athletics, college athletics, is because this is the nature of it. It's just more prevalent probably in football and then men's basketball, and then it kind of filters down to some of these others. But football, you're seeing it right now where you had something like 2,500 people enter the transfer portal, less than 800 have been picked up, but a majority of those have probably been tampered with. And so if Jim Mora wants to go out there and actually, pull the receipts and actually let people know and use legal recourse to be able to do it, maybe there's some justifications there. Maybe. The end of the day, it really comes down to, the college football needing a collective bargaining agreement. Now, how you get there is a difficult task, because then you have, a whole sort of other things, whether that be eligibility or making, players employees. The NCAA doesn't generally really want that because it makes it much more difficult. They're essentially employees right now, especially with the schools having to pay them eventually with athletic resources and different things. But the reality is there's no CBA to really enforce this. For example, in the NFL, there is a tampering rule. There is a legal 2-day tampering period where players that are on a team can talk to prospective new teams under that 2-day tampering period, legal tampering period. Okay, and so teams can do that. They can have conversations. Everything's fine. That's legitimate. That's been agreed upon. Everybody understands that if you're going to talk to players from another team, you have that 2-day period. Outside of that, tampering is tampering. And if you're found to be tampering, in which recently, several teams have been found to tamper, it happens. There's, various recourse that can be taken, whether that be losing draft picks or whether that monetary penalties, or all of the above, right? There's different things to do this. So this isn't just one of those things where it's like, oh, tampering, everybody does it, be on your way. This is literally something that the NFL does, the NBA does, all these professional leagues do. And if you're trying to become like a professional league, which, let's be real, college football is becoming more and more the minor league system of professional football, this is where you're going to go, especially with the NIL world. As I've told people, a lot of people want to be frustrated with NIL, and there's many reasons to be frustrated with NIL because the true intent of NIL is not what it is now. It's essentially to pay for play, right? You're paying people to stay at a university to play using whatever funds. Some of that is the athletic department funds. Some of that is through collectives or NILs. True NIL is actually paying somebody to be in commercials or to use their image on something, right? But we're using NIL as this catch-all phrase as an opportunity just to pay players a salary. And so the problem here is there's no guidelines. The NCAA can't even enforce a lot of the NIL right now. They're trying to make situations where there's a clearinghouse and a third party that's outside of the NCAA can kind of weigh in on these. But the reality is it's not going to be really easy to do. They haven't been able to do this. This is not something that's been an effective thing. Unless they can legitimately streamline something, it's not going to work. And so for the most part, there's not a lot the NCAA can do right now. Now they have the power to do that, whether it be conference commissioners coming together and kind of agreeing on something. Maybe you come up with a full, college football commissioner. I doubt that actually has some value. Recently there was comments that Nick Saban should be made that. I don't think a coach should ever be made that, whether he's good or not, because it's different, right? You need somebody else that has perspective to be able to help with that. Other people have talked about, Andrew Luck or somebody like that, and these brilliant minds that have played football and understand it. Whatever the case, you need to find some sort of opportunities to be able to make things tighter, right? The biggest issue here, and this one applied to Utah, is you have players that have signed an agreement with Utah. They have committed to come back to Utah, or they've committed to come to Utah, and suddenly somebody throws more money at them after they've signed this. And, I don't know the full legal recourse on that and what those contracts look like and how binding they are. But other teams are being able to do stuff where they're throwing more money at them and they leave, right? You had Cameron Calhoun, for example, corner at Utah, transferred in last year, freshman from Michigan, had a pretty standout season. They were able to transform him into a player that was, a really good contributing player. Was he perfect yet? No. Obviously, with what Utah's done with corners, they've been able to have success and were able to do what they could with him and saw a lot of growth and progress from him. But after he announced that he, was coming back and he was a Utah man and everything, and we've talked about this, suddenly more money was thrown his way. Clearly a team was tampering with him and piqued his interest enough where it was a dollar amount that Utah essentially is just going to say, look, we're not going to play around with, right? And if other teams want to be able to do it, so be it. At the end of the day, he ends up at Alabama. Alabama wasn't the one that threw the cash around to get him out into the portal, but he's landed at Alabama. And it may be a good thing for him, right? We don't really know. You never really know if the grass is greener, those kinds of things. You hope for his sake that, he makes a good choice and that works. The reality there is, though, is that teams tampered with a Utah player, right? He was committed. Whether that commitment meant a fully verbalized contract or a signed contract, it varies, right? And so you've got teams that are still doing that, where as coaches, I don't want to say here pity to the coaches. I mean, they do to some extent, because this is tough, right? If you're a coach trying to be able to solidify a roster anymore is becoming a very difficult time. But it's not one of those things where, I'm going to feel sorry for coaches. At the end of the day, this is the nature of college football, and if you want to be in this business, you're getting paid handsomely to be able to do it. So, I'm happy to take it for a year to try it out and get the salary that they are. They're getting paid well enough to be able to do the job that they need to. It's going to be fine, right? And so you're going to hear coaches complaining, and they should, right? And I'm not saying just because they're getting paid and they've signed up for this that they shouldn't complain, but at the same time, these are the rules that are currently available, or lack of rules that are currently available. And so you've got to be able to have some sort of contractual agreement, to lock these kids in. And if you don't, you're going to continue to have this wild, wild west where you've essentially signed your roster, you think everything's okay, and then suddenly a team swoops in and steals them. That's a challenge, right? Like, for all intents and purposes, Cam Calhoun was locked in and ready to go. Same happened with Keanu Tanavasa. He was locked in, ready to go, was, everything ready. And last minute, just a few days before the portal hit, he announced that he's entering the transfer portal. And, it became a challenge. You have guys that are suddenly getting thrown money to be able to do what they should. You can't knock a player for wanting to go in the transfer portal. I say this all the time. I understand people frustrated that they say the transfer portal sucks and it's ruining college football. I disagree personally. I see it as much bigger landscape where I'm not, so tied into Utah where I feel like I have to be so committed to these players. But at the same time, these guys are going to go wherever they want to. If you want to go get a new job, you can go get a new job, right? That's the nature of it. The difference is when you're trying to compile a roster and you're trying to commit to some of these things, there needs to be some sort of value added. Now, with that said, if I wanted to leave my job today and somebody was talking to me, there's no tampering rules in my profession, right? Now, it's not a one-to-one or an apple to oranges, or it's an apples and oranges comparison. They're similar, but they're not quite the same because in sports, you've got to have some sort of tampering rules, right? In my profession, they used to have the non-disclosure stuff, or not non-disclosure, the non-compete, that's the word, where you couldn't do stuff like that. But more and more, those are going away in most professions, right? Now, in sports, they have to exist because there has to be some level of consistency, or else it becomes a wild, wild west every single season, like we're seeing in college football. And so I'm curious to see where this all goes. Like I said, Utah has as much complaints as anybody else because you do have somebody like a Keanu Tanavasa and Cam Calhoun who were essentially tampered with to be able to leave after being committed to Utah. They'd already agreed to Utah. They already said that they would. Now, whether that meant that they were before and they were just using this as another reason to get more money, I don't know, right? And I'm not going to play that game. The reality is they were signed in to play for Utah for the next season, and regardless of who put out the money out there, and you can, there's a lot of rumors about who they are. BYU is trying to steal all of Utah's players. Sure. And there's some legitimacy to that, right? Like BYU has pushed really hard to get some of these Utah players into the portal to destabilize Utah. I don't think it's just to destabilize them in terms of a rival. I think they want those players, right? Now it's an added benefit to be able to destabilize your rival. But at the same time, all these other schools are doing it as well. The USCs, Michigan, Alabama, Utah's doing it as well, I'm sure, right? And I know they are. So it's like, this becomes a challenge where this is something where you're trying to lock these players in, but there's no real backing. There's no backbone, essentially, right? And so it becomes a challenge. So we'll see. There was a lot of talk about Smith Snowden and Lander Barton being pursued by BYU as well. They pursued them heavily. I think the longest conversation on Twitter that I've ever seen is about Smith Snowden. Where is he going to stay? Is he going to go? What kind of stuff? It's crazy, but at the same time, that's the nature of college football. And right now, you've got 21 scholarship players that have left Utah. There's more. I'm assuming my count is right. I've tried to keep track. I have a spreadsheet that tracks all the incoming and outgoing players. Some of that gets a little tricky with with walk-on players or different things that way. Some may lose scholarships. Some may be, kind of gently pushed out. Some may leave on their own. It becomes a challenge to kind of track some of this stuff. As much as this is a daily thing that I'm looking at, I may have missed somebody. So by my count, and I could be wrong, 21 scholarship players have left Utah. It's the players that have left since we last had a podcast were Micah Pittman. I didn't know he had any more eligibility left, so I'm curious to see how that went. I would be surprised if he really goes anywhere. Mike Mitchell, he committed to Arizona. Excuse me. As I mentioned, Keanu Tanavasa, he just recently announced today that he's going to BYU. And then Tayshawn Lyons, wide receiver, last second. I love the Tayshawn Lyons stuff. Tayshawn is one of those players that for the entire season has kind of been frustrated with Utah. And so I don't think it really came as a surprise that he was going to enter the portal. The funny thing there is though, he waited so long in the portal to be able to go. I expected him, honestly, to be one of the first few players to enter the portal, and he was actually the last. And so the best part about him is a national reporter. A lot of these guys that do their tracking services of the portals, they do a good job. They have access to the portal, all that kind of stuff. They said that he had been in the transfer portal. 2 hours later, there was another tweet that said that he had withdrawn. So Tayshawn Lyons was coming back to Utah. Long tenure, we'll call it the Russell Westbrook era of the Utah Jazz type stuff. So, and then like 2 days later, he was back in the portal, and by all accounts, it's for good. So, fascinating situation. I don't know the nature of that one. Honestly, I haven't pursued that one much because it was always kind of a foregone conclusion that he was going to leave Utah to transfer. He wasn't happy with the situation, felt like he should get more playing time. Yeah, it is what it is. It's somebody that wants to showcase their talents, and they should be able to get that opportunity. And for Utah, it just wasn't a situation that was going to work out. And I'm going to guess, based on the conversations that I've had, it was kind of a mutual thing. Utah was, they wanted him, but at the same time, if he was going to continue to be frustrated and not be happy with where he's at, it's just better to leave. So you have that. So as part of that, in my estimation, out of all of these players, most of them are contributors. They're, some of them are starters. That doesn't mean that they were the best starters, but they had some varying degrees. To me, the three biggest losses, and, this is arguable. There's other players that you could throw in there, and I've already thought of one that I could put in there. Keanu Tenavasa is probably your biggest one, just simply because of his ability to be able to play on that starting unit on the defensive side of the ball. Was a great asset there, was a big motivating factor in that team, and although he wasn't a captain, he was essentially a captain in his voice and kind of keeping guys together. The Tenavasa stuff kind of got a little tricky because the way that he announced his departure rubbed people the wrong way. And I'm not going to get into that because I don't, it's up to you to decide, why, your frustrations. At the end of the day, he decided to make a business decision, and you can agree with it or not. Ultimately, he landed with BYU today, and then posted another tweet, kind of about how, he's a very religious kid. And he's used God and religion as a big motivating factor for where he's at, right, and leaving. So maybe that fits, going to BYU. But I think it's rubbed people the wrong way just simply because how he's using Scripture, essentially, to kind of combat some of the complaints for him. And I get it. Fans are frustrated. Utah fans especially are frustrated the way that he went about it after saying he was locked in for the 2025 year and then leaving and then going to the rival. There's a whole bunch there. And like I said, it doesn't really matter. I at the end of the day, you want players that are committed to your program, right? And I understand Keanu was seemingly committed for a long time. Now that can change, right? Maybe he wants a more religious opportunity going to BYU. I don't know, and I think that's up for each person to decide, right? I'm not trying to tell fans how to fan because that's on you. Obviously, there are scenarios where take Isaac Wilson, for example. After he entered the transfer portal, there was a lot of negative things said about him. He comes back, and now you have to kind of eat those words. I would just say be cautious about these things. It's not always something that is easy. These players are trying to do the best for themselves, and unfortunately, you've tied your emotions to a player that really, I'm just gonna say it, it really doesn't matter, right? Like, you can fan and be a fan of Utah, but at the same time, it doesn't matter. There was a potential that Keanu was going to go to the NFL, and you would have lost him anyway. So, in your mind, and I understand it's not going to be there because of the way it went down and that he went to your rival, that it's not going to have that feeling. But at the end of the day, you want players locked in. I've always said that. Like, for me, like in my business, I want to work with people that are locked in and want to be with me. I've lost a lot of very talented coworkers that have wanted to go do other things, or they've worked for a rival or different things that way. At the end of the day, that doesn't make, me hate them. this is, let me say, these are my personal feelings, right? So like I said, fan how you want to fan. But for me, it sucks sometimes, but at the same time, I want people committed to building what we have, right? I want that, in my work. I want that in other scenarios. Like, you want to be able to have people that are committed. And if they're not committed to that for varying reasons, some just aren't committed because they don't like it. Some are feeling like, they're not getting their shot or whatever that may be. They need to be committed. And that's where Utah needs, right? Last year, I'm saying last season, 2024 season, there were guys that when things started to go rough, that locker room wasn't perfect, right? And everybody kind of heard the rumors, and, to substantiate some of it, it was there. And you can imagine that when you have a season like that, there's going to be players in that locker room that are not bought in. And you can do all that you can to be able to fight and keep that there. But at the end of the day, they're essentially energy suckers, right? They're the ones pulling away from the main, goals of what's going on. And it sucks to lose some talented people, right? Utah's lost some talented players over the years. It happens. But at the end of the day, you want players committed to where you're at. So for Utah, you want players committed to Utah. And it sucks, but you've got to be able to find those guys that want to be hungry and they want to get better and they want to look at this season and say, 5-7 was not where we wanted to be. This is where we need to go. It's clear that Utah has found players that want to do that. You were able to get a new quarterback that was going to be your starting quarterback who has a ton of potential. And yes, it's an opportunity for him to play up at the Power 4 level and to follow his offensive coordinator. So there's some ties there. But you also found a 4-star running back who had, suitors from all over the country decide that Utah was where it was going to be at. You have guys that locked in. So whether Keanu wants to stay locked in or Cam wants to stay locked in or Carson Ryan, that's the third person that I would say is probably one of your bigger losses, although, he wasn't able to do a ton, even though he played a ton. You have players that want to play for you. Invest in them. Be frustrated that you lost those players, right? But, move on. And, invest in the people that are buying into your program, because at the end of the day, that's going to be better for you. You can spare that energy and move forward and go on. So I've spent a lot of time on that. I didn't expect to do that. And like I said, I don't want to tell you how to fan, but I think there's, have some perspective with this. The transfer portal, yeah, it sucks, right? Like you buy into a lot of these players and you get excited for them, but it doesn't change college football. You can't have it both ways where you say that college football is ruined and then at the same time celebrate all the transfers that come in and then celebrate your team the way that you did. And you can, but at the same time, celebrate the team, right? You can be happy about the individual players and you can like who they are and all the things that way, but at the end of the day, celebrate the team. And I think you'll be fine. It helps you. It'll ease your calm. You'll be much more calm. Maybe Utah fans aren't calm. I get it. Yeah, you're wanting more always, and so that's something. You want something for your team, and I appreciate that. Covering Utah for the last decade plus, it is nice to see passionate fans that want to do it, and they want to be committed to Utah. But at the same time, it's going to be okay. You've got a long time till fall, and yes, it sucks to lose these players, but football is going to return. College football isn't going away. Utah's still going to be competitive, and as much as there's more questions going into next year as there were this year, I think that makes Utah more hungry. And I think that allows you to be able to come in with some of those distractions gone where there was this pressure that everything had to hit because you had Cam Rising coming back and you had to do all these things. Now you're kind of having to band together and come together and say, look, we're not a 5-7 team. We've never been a 5-7 team. Obviously they were, but you can have that mindset in your head to say we are a couple plays from being 8-4 or whatever it may be. Maybe it was 9-3, 10-2. I don't know, whatever you want to paint as your kind of mental picture. They can use this now as kind of that building. You look at BYU or Arizona State. They were picked at the bottom of the Big 12, right? And these are two teams that BYU just missed out on a playoff, and Arizona State is in the playoff with a first-round bye. There's some power in that, to being able to play the underdog where nobody believes in you. People generally believe in Utah, and that's why they were picked to win the conference last year. But I think now you've kind of reclaimed some of that, and now you get to work in a way where you don't have to have those distractions. That's not to say Utah shouldn't build for those moments. Utah should. Utah should try to build for those moments where they're picked every single year as the top team. It's not going to happen, but they should be building for that, right? If Utah really believes that they are in that type of a class, and I know that they do, they should be building for that. So now you have to be able to build that mindset and work to it. But for this next year, your backs are not against the wall. You've got everybody that is going to come at you for various reasons. Utah still is kind of that team that everybody hates, and so the longer that Utah stays down, the better. And so there's going to be some of that stuff, but now this is a time for the guys that have invested in Utah. This is the time to be able to move forward. And the reality is college football has had more parity over this last year or two because of the transfer portal that it helps. And so, yeah, like I said, it sucks. I don't want to belabor this anymore. It sucks to lose players, but you've got a team that is ready to go. So we'll see how that goes. So speaking of that, yes, you did lose 21 scholarship players, but you bring in 15 scholarship players as of now. They're still having visits with players. They're going to be trying to get in more guys. But for the most part, you did everything that you could to be able to build, especially on offense. So out of your 15 players that came in from the transfer portal, and you've got some others that are preferred walk-ons, and I'm not counting those in those. But you've got 9 players that came on the offensive side of the ball, 5 on defense, and then you had a punter. So you've got a good thing going on. You got 2 quarterbacks in Devin Dampier. Obviously, he is expected to be your starter. Was a sophomore this last year, and so he's got 2 years of eligibility to be able to really help Utah build. Already in the system with Jason Beck, and so they've got that chemistry and they're able to move forward. By all accounts, it seems like that's going to be a good thing for Utah, right? And as a true dual threat quarterback, that gives Utah a completely different look than they've had the last few years. They hoped that Nate Johnson would kind of be that to some extent. Cam Rising could be that, obviously got injured. They kind of hoped Isaac Wilson could be some of that. But Devin Dampier is far more the true dual threat quarterback. Obviously has to improve on some of his passing and different things that way. But for the most part, really solid player. And I've spent a whole podcast talking about him, so I don't need to go into that. But then you signed another guy in Brendan Zerbrug from Oklahoma. He was a freshman. He comes in, adds some depth. And so he and Isaac Wilson are kind of on that same plane in the sense that they came in the same recruiting class. Isaac obviously has a lot more playing experience, but the intent, at least from what I understand, is that Isaac is going to try to redshirt this season. So whatever that means in terms of how he falls in that depth chart, I don't really know. Obviously, he was put into a situation that didn't really work for him last year. It wasn't expected that he was going to play the entire season. It was more spot treatments, maybe even redshirt because you could play in 4 games, that kind of stuff. So we'll see how Isaac fits into that equation, how Brendan Zerbrug fits into that equation. And then you've got 2 freshman quarterbacks that are coming in from, recruiting class. Don't expect them to be in there. But you've at least got some depth of at least 5 players in there. As much as you don't want Isaac to play so that he can continue to develop, you do have somebody that is experienced. He's at least seen Division I tape. And obviously as the season went, his confidence seemed to wane and, he got worse in some respects, but I think you've seen his potential and you can see what can happen. Now with a full year under a new system that probably jives more to his play style, he absolutely used the RPO well at Corner Canyon. I think this system fits him better. So if that's the situation where he's there or Brendan is, I think Utah's in a good situation. But once again, on paper, it's hard to know. Going into last season, we thought that Utah was going to be this team that steamrolled and on paper looked great, and I still believe that they could have been. But when you recruit to one player and you have your system based on that, and that player gets injured in your second game of the season, everything kind of went away. And so Utah has done a much better job of kind of building around that to kind of have it as complementary players where, let's say Devin Dampier does go down, the players that they've got kind of fit that same model. And the players that they've recruited in other skills positions kind of fit that model as well in terms of complementing that. And so I think you'll see a much more synced up offense in terms of kind of the general skill set, right? They all kind of work in unison. Yes, it is kind of to I would say it's not to one player. It's not like everything is fit around Devin Dampier. It's more of just kind of a wholesale change and reset that allows Utah to work. So you've got that. Your running backs. You bring in 3 running backs, obviously highlighted by Wayshawn Parker, 4-star freshman from Washington State, had a phenomenal year, rushed for almost 800 yards. A lot of people say he looks like a Zach Moss. Some say he looks like Ty Jordan. Whatever that may be, if you can get anywhere near that and he can have that workhorse production, especially with what he did at Washington State and continue to build on that, that is going to be great. He's obviously familiar with his running back coach because he was coached under him last year in Mark Atuaya. And so you've got some similarities there. Once again, now you've got your first 2 skills players, your quarterback and your running back, that have experience with their coaching staff. That is huge, coming into a new system. Now, after that, they did bring in Devin Green from UNLV, was a freshman running back this year, so that adds some more youth to that. But at the same time, now you've got more talent to be able to move forward, right? So you've got years where you're stacking this. You also brought in Aquari Rogers from New Mexico, junior. So a guy with a little more experience probably could be as a backup, get some of those spot treatment, third down situations, 3rd and short. Assuming that Wayshawn Parker's not that guy. But you've got now some depth with some experience to be able to add to that, while also bringing in 2 true freshman running backs from the recruiting class. So you've rebuilt an entire running back room. Hunter Andrews is still kind of your question there on whether he'll stay at running back or switch over to linebacker. He's been playing both sides. So we'll see what happens there. But for the most part, Utah's done well to rebuild this room. They've got talent, talent that has performed at this level. You've also got guys that have, been able to work. When Rogers, he's a junior, he's got experience, he's a veteran, comes in with Jason Beck and has an understanding of that kind of the system there, and so that works for you. And helps that way. So you've got that. You've got 3 wide receivers that came in Creed Whitmore, Mississippi State. You've got Ryan Davis from New Mexico and Otto Tia from Utah State. Otto Tia is a really fascinating one, really solid player that has a lot of talent. Really came on, especially at the latter part of the Utah State year. Had quarterbacks that could throw him the ball and did well. Really curious to see if he can take that up, at the next level. I have to believe that he can, but we'll see. Bigger bodied guy, local kid, came from Northridge High. So that's going to be there. You've got 4-star wide receiver Creed Whitmore. Ryan Davis, once again, another New Mexico guy, veteran player, has been in the system, understands Jason Beck's system, utilized it. And so you've got some consistency there. And then you got an offensive lineman to kind of add that, a young offensive lineman that probably won't factor in immediately, but at least it adds some depth. And so looking from the offensive side of the ball, I have to believe that Utah is going to continue to pursue wide receivers. They want to continue to add more depth there, maybe look for another running back. I don't think they'd go too much further into the running back. Obviously if the right player came along, Rasul Faison from Utah State is a player that, obviously has a ton of experience. You pair, him with Wayshawn Parker and Devin Dampier, and you've got a pretty dynamic run opportunity. I'd love to see maybe a triple option type scenario in some settings. That would be phenomenal. But you've got other players that can step up and do well and kind of come to Utah if they are recruited. So, for the next 10 days or so, I would expect you to kind of pay attention to running back and wide receiver on the offensive side of the ball. But for the most part, Utah's done well to rebuild their offense. They did have 2 players in Michael Washington Jr., a running back, and Joseph Williams, a wide receiver, that had committed to Utah and then decided to switch. That's another layer of this transfer portal and all that kind of stuff. But Michael Washington went to Arkansas and Joseph Williams went to Colorado. It sucks for Utah, especially for Joseph Williams, because he was a young wide receiver with a ton of talent, bigger body that was expected to produce, and he goes elsewhere. But like I said, you want players that are committed. Defensively, Utah picked up 2 defensive linemen, Lance Holtzclaw from Washington and Jackson Jones from Oregon, legacy recruit. These are players that have a little bit more experience and should be able to contribute more How they factor into that defensive line remains to be seen. Obviously, with Keanu leaving, that opens up some opportunities there, but I'm curious to see how they fit in. But really solid players, especially Lance Holtzclaw, who has some experience, should be able to factor into that room and figure out kind of some depth there and help Utah. And then Utah also added 3 corners: Jeremiah Caldwell from the JUCO ranks, Garden City Community College, Donovan Sanders from Texas A&M, and Blake Cotton from UC Davis, so the FCS ranks. Those last 2 players are juniors, and so you've got experienced guys that have been in the system, have done well. High-end guys that could produce, especially in Sharif Shah's system. So you have to like what they do. I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to pursue maybe another corner. Obviously, you want to probably get somebody more on the defensive line since Tanavasa kind of caught them off guard. But I think for the most part, that's kind of where Utah's at. They're not going to be. I don't want to say they're not going to be much more active, because they're still going to be active. But I think you've seen them solidify a lot of the pieces or the position groups that they needed to, especially on the offensive side of the ball. As I said, the offensive side was where it needed to work. So we'll see how that goes. We'll continue to update on that. But for the most part, this college football season is winding down. Obviously, the playoffs are continuing this week with the quarterfinals. So we'll see what happens there. But for the most part, Utah's all in on the 2025 season. They don't report until next week for their winter conditioning. But for the most part, Utah is locked in and ready to go. And then, we'll continue to follow this and obviously have a lot of conversations about it. But that's it for that. So to finish out the podcast, we'll talk a little bit about some of the other sports. Utah men's basketball returns to action tomorrow. This is Tuesday, where they take tomorrow is Tuesday, I should say, where they travel to Waco to take on number 25 Baylor at 12 p.m. So it's a morning game. You can watch that, or afternoon game, and then you can have your New Year's Eve celebrations and all that stuff if you're interested in that. Baylor obviously is a great team. Won the national championship a few years ago. They consistently continue to be one of the better teams in the Big 12, and obviously being ranked number 25 showcases that. So really tall challenge for Utah as they open up conference play with a tough team. This is obviously a team that Caleb Lohner was on and Miro Little was on, so there is some familiarity there in terms of understanding what Baylor does, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the court, right? So you've got to be able to, Craig Smith, we talked to him yesterday in a little press conference at Sunday night. We were able to chat with him, and he talked about needing to play a near perfect game, and I think that's to the point where Utah's at. I don't know that it has to be near perfect in all of these Big 12 games, but on a team like Baylor, you do have to be near perfect. And for the most part, Utah has been mostly fine, right? Like, it's not like this is a team that is completely terrible. The problem is they're not able to piece it together throughout the full game, and no team fully can, but Utah's doing it at a much. They're not being able to be consistent at a much higher rate, lower rate. I don't know what I'm trying to say there. They're not able to do it at a consistent rate. We'll just say that. So Craig Smith has been tinkering with some of his lineups. Recently, he's been using one of those guards, the one that Mike Sharv jumps in that position where he was starting. Hunter Erickson has taken some reps there as the starter. Mason Madsen in the last game against Iowa got the start there. This is, there's still some tinkering. Starting lineups, I know back in the day, Jerry Sloan used to talk about all the time, former Jazz coach, that it doesn't matter who starts, it matters who finishes. And I truly believe more and more that you want guys that are trusted. And so whoever starts really isn't the point. I think it's the guys who can produce consistently. And unfortunately, Utah just hasn't really found that flow yet. They had it, and then the bigs came back, and it kind of started to kind of change that. Now, that's not necessarily on the bigs. That's not on Lawson Lovering or Zach Keller. It's more just Utah has kind of changed in how they've played, right? They're not playing together. That's not it hasn't been this free-flowing offense as it has been in the past. The defense has had some lapses as well. And so it's a collective effort to really kind of take over. They have the talent. Like I said, they have the talent to be able to do it and can compete with these teams as their quad one games. And those quad one games kind of vary depending on how these teams go. But by all accounts, at the time that they played the teams, they have had 3 quad one games. And so Utah, they need to be more consistent, and they found a way to lose these games late. Craig Smith talked about it yesterday, saying that there's something like 8 possessions away from being an undefeated team. And it's easy to say that right now because it's non-conference and you were close. But if that continues to be that way, it just, it's another losing season, and it's not something that you want to be able to have. And so this is a team that is intent on trying to get to the NCAA tournament. It's going to be a tall task, right? You've got to be able to steal some of these early games to be able to kind of get that confidence to say that you can compete in the Big 12 and have the ability to be able to, hit at a consistent rate from the free throw line. Above everything else, free throw shooting has been one of the biggest knocks against this Utah team, and it has been for the last few years for some reason, which is crazy because Craig Smith's teams generally do have good free throw shooting, but for some reason, these last few years at Utah, it just hasn't clicked. And this year, they're shooting 64.5% as a team, which ranks 335th in the country. That's not great at all. That's like deep quad 4 type team level shooting. So if Utah can get its free throw shooting at a much higher clip, I think that at least gives them less room or more room for error, I would say, that allows them to be able to have some of these situations where maybe they're not hitting all the time, but they can use their defense to be able to lock down the other team or whatever that may be. Because by all accounts, this is a team that can shoot well. They're ranked 16th in effective field goal at 57.6%. They haven't turned over the ball that much this season. They ranked 51st in the country. They're getting rebounds, especially offensive rebounds. They're one of the best in the country. Well, top 50 in the country. I want to say best, but top 50. And they're shooting the three ball well, right? They're shooting 38% essentially from 3-point line, which is 40th in the country. So you've got a team that can compete. The question is can they continue to do that from, for the full 40 minutes? And, there are lapses, and they're not getting that at times, and they kind of look like they're trying to play hero ball, or they're not really in sync, and yet they still continue to fight and get in there. Every single one of these games that they've had that's been a quad 1 opportunity, they've fought to the very last minute and tried to get a win late, and it just doesn't work out. But this is a team that needs to continue to kind of find that consistency, continue to get with a lineup that works so that they can have that opportunity to work together and gel. One of those questions out there is Keanu Dawes. Early on, he was getting a lot of minutes, freshman, obviously, and suddenly his minutes have shrinked. Some of that has gone to Caleb Lohner, and that's going to go to Caleb Lohner because he's more of experience. He brings a lot of physicality. He's just a guy that gets in there and tries to mix it up, right? Keanu has also fouled a lot. It's kind of those early years as a freshman when you start fouling a lot and you're not used to the size, and so you use things that don't really work. Craig talked about him needing to kind of just become more well-rounded to be able to see minutes. I don't think this is necessarily an indication that they don't have faith in Keanu. It's just more he needs to continue to grow as a freshman. So similar to how we talk about in football, how it's not easy for a freshman to come in and contribute. I would say it's easier as a freshman in basketball, but it's still not always easy because it's a challenge, except for some of these very elite players that can come in there and turn the tide. That's not to say Keanu can't be in there. He obviously provides a level of physicality and athleticism that I don't think Utah has for the most part right now. I think if he can put it all together, can be a star. We just haven't fully seen it yet, and Craig obviously isn't seeing that in practice. So curious to see how that develops for him. But for the most part, this is a team that has potential. Is it going to shock everybody in the Big 12? I don't want to say, I don't think so, but I think there's potential where they can be much better than being picked last, right? We'll see, though. These early games aren't going to be easy, but I think if you can be competitive in these and Utah can stay healthy, there's a chance. And maybe you steal some of these games that you weren't expected. You steal this win against Baylor on the road, that sends a huge message to Utah alone that they can compete. And then you come home on January 4th, so Saturday, and you bring in a Texas Tech team that is receiving votes. They're another good team, but now you're at home. You've kind of got that on your side. Suddenly things can change. So we'll see what happens. Important week, two teams, inside the top 25 conversation, one being ranked, the other just barely outside of that. But we'll see kind of how Utah handles that. So right now their net ranking is 63, Ken Palm 64. Outside of the NCAA tournament by those metrics, but you still have some of these wins and you start having some success, and maybe you have an opportunity to kind of get there. But a lot of work needing to be done. It's going to be a tall task every single game to be able to get wins. Maybe Oklahoma State is probably one of your easiest opportunities, and that's not even going to be easy. But this is going to be a tough season, and we'll see what kind of Utah's made of. So we'll now switch to Utah women's basketball. They're ranked 26th in the net, a little lower than where they have been the last couple of years, but at the same time, they've been able to perform well. They're not ranked in the top 25, but are ranked 27th if you were to extend the rankings. But this is a team that, even though you lose Alyssa Peely, has been able to find different ways to win. Obviously, they shoot well from behind the three-point line, but they've been able to find a much better situation of being able to close at the rim. Similar to how the men haven't been able to close at the rim at times, the women have really struggled at this at times. They kind of rush themselves. They hear footsteps, so to speak, and you hurry your shot and they rim out or whatever that may be. But this is a team that's improving and obviously has a great opportunity in front of them as one of the top teams in the Big 12. Still a lot to prove, still kind of showcasing what they can do. I think teams or people are still hesitant to kind of put Utah in that top 25 until they can kind of get some more wins out of the way. But this is another team that if they can get to be consistent, I think it'll be much more readily apparent of how talented this team can be. I think they have a much better chance of being able to showcase that than the men do. They're just a team that's been connected for years. They obviously have a lot of returning players. The new players that have come in, Maya Torre has really done well the last little bit. Has been great in the post, whether it's being making shots or collecting rebounds, being physical. Add her with Jenna Johnson, who is just your physical presence. It becomes a great opportunity for Utah. So they also play tomorrow at 12 p.m. Gotta love when two teams that I cover play at the exact same time. Never an ideal situation, but you make do. But they are on the road at Arizona, another familiar team to them, obviously, from the Pac-12 days. So still not fully in the Big 12 slate in terms of new opponents, but you are in conference opponents, and so you've got opportunities there. Arizona is a tough team, has always kind of been right there in the mix. Utah, on paper, should be a better team. There were some mishaps over the last few years at Arizona. Refs haven't always been helpful. Arizona's been a tricky team, so this will be a tall task for them as well, but a good opportunity to start Big 12, to be in the second game of Big 12 play. And then you have on Sunday another road game, this time against Iowa State at 4:30 p.m. So good opportunities there, and we'll see how that goes. And then lastly, on Friday night, the Red Rocks open up their 2025 season. They welcome in Utah State at 7 p.m. to the Huntsman Center. Really, really fascinating to see how this team comes together. A lot of depth at all the events. Really, really curious to see what Carly Dockendorf does with the lineups. In the Red Rocks preview, she moved around a lot of different players or athletes and was trying to tinker with that. And I imagine she's going to tinker with that a lot this year. This schedule is not Murderer's Row, and so I think she can play around with it a bit, especially as those harder meets are later on in the season. You still have the Sprouts meeting where you're playing against or competing against some of the top teams in the country early on, but that's one meet, one quad meet out of the front that they can prepare for, and then the rest they can kind of tinker and do some stuff, but. It's a fun environment. As I've said many times, if you haven't been to a Red Rocks meet, it's time to go. They're a lot of fun. They're high energy. The gymnasts are phenomenal athletes and do a lot of great work. So Curious to see how that goes. Obviously, with an in-state meet, Utah is clearly the better opponent or team. And so the fascinating thing is they play Utah State 3 times this year, or compete against Utah State 3 times this year. So really interested in that. I don't think it's great, but at the same time, this can be a special season. It's the 50th season for the Red Rocks, and so we'll see what happens there. But it's a busy day on our busy week on the Utah athletics front. So that's it for today. We'll try to get another podcast up soon. But that's it for the 2024 year. I hope you all celebrate responsibly on New Year's Eve with whatever you do. I'll probably be just playing games with family, hanging out that way, and trying to keep it low key. But I hope you have a safe holidays. And then we'll catch you in the 2025 season or 25 year, and we'll continue with this. So for that, I'm signing off today, and we will have a wonderful week. Adios.